It's time to start already.
Okay.
It's 9:51. I think this is my last scheduled time to teach for this trimester, and I've enjoyed being able to teach it. I feel like it had been a couple of years maybe since I taught a class, maybe even back to like COVID, like the summer of COVID maybe. But I enjoyed the opportunity to teach, and I hope that the material that has been presented, with maybe taking a different angle, a different view, a different approach with looking at some of these New Testament characters, maybe some that are not very well known, and hopefully digging in and figuring out how all these pieces of the New Testament, all these individuals, even if they, like we've mentioned, even if they only have 2 or 3 lines mentioned to their name, they still can have a massive impact on the gospel story in the New Testament in general. This morning we're going to be talking about Ananias, Felix, Festus, and Agrippa II. I think I enjoyed my last study a little bit more with Erastus and Trophimus and those men. But these men we'll kind of walk through, because they all kind of fall right in the timeline of the end of Acts and how they play into the story, the further story of Paul. And so before we do that, I wanted to give just a little bit of background to kind of give us an idea of where we're coming from and then where we're going to be going with getting into studying these 4 men this morning. But like we talked about the last time I had taught, we in Acts 21 we see where Paul is coming back, where he had just completed his 3rd missionary journey. He had actually, in about a 10-year span, had completed 3 missionary journeys. But he had just arrived back into Jerusalem there in Acts chapter 21, verse 17. And then we see shortly thereafter there were some things that had occurred, with Paul, meeting with the elders and whatnot there at the church in Jerusalem, and how they had requested him to go and cleanse himself, to purify himself with these other men. And then these Jews from Asia see Paul in the temple and accuse him of defiling and desecrating it. And if you remember, one of those men that we had talked about, whose name was Trophimus, who was a Gentile Christian from Ephesus, the Jews from Asia had seen Trophimus with Paul and had made that assumption that Trophimus had gone into the temple with Paul, which there again, as we talked about, the controversy there is that Gentiles weren't allowed into the temple, and it was actually punishable by death. And you see during this timeline, this balance of, well, I'm a Jew, but I'm also a Christian. But then there's other Christians who are Gentiles, and how do you balance all that? That's some of what Paul is, or how do you go through all of that to where you're still being sensitive to the Jewish community and also the Gentiles. And I think we're going to find some things that are ironic as we get into this study about, the whole reason that we're going to be talking this morning is because Paul was accused by the Jews of desecrating the temple, among other things, of stirring up controversy in these things. But Paul's impact on Jews and their timidness to convert to Christianity. So we see Paul, as we're going to talk about this morning. We're not going to talk so much about his first appeal, but in the midst of these, basically from chapter 22 through the end of the book of Acts, we're going to see Paul defending himself 6 times. The first one is he's defending himself there on the stairwell after the Roman soldier had pulled him away from the crowd, and he asked the soldier to actually defend himself to the Jewish people. And then we see him, as we're going to talk about next, is that he stands before the Jewish council to give his defense, and then after escaping a death plot, then we see where he stands before Felix, and then Festus, and then even Herod Agrippa, and then we won't study this morning, but then ultimately getting to Rome. And so you see 6 times where he is defending himself after coming back from this missionary journey, after being present at the temple, and it just seems like Paul can't escape being out of trouble. So the first man that we're going to talk about is Ananias, and Darrell made sure that I got the right Ananias. So, because there's a few of them in Acts, right? So we know Ananias that met with Paul and helped with Paul's conversion and took Paul in. We know Ananias and Sapphira, which we've talked about as well. But then we have the final Ananias, and maybe, and definitely an interesting individual. So he was the high priest in Jerusalem during much of Paul's ministry. So Ananias would have been high priest from around 47 to roughly 58 AD. The dates may, depending on where you're looking, may shift 1 year or another in either direction, but that's roughly the timeline. And so he was the high priest for about 12 years. And he was appointed by Herod Chalcis, however you pronounce his name, around that 47 AD. It was actually the second priest that Herod Chalcis had appointed, and was actually the second longest serving high priest after you get kind of past into the Hasmonean period. So that period right before the destruction of the temple, and then the priesthood ceases to exist. So he would have been the second longest serving high priest of that time period. But Ananias, was not a good man. And so he was somebody that was known for bribery. He would plunder a lot of the temple offerings. He was a very harsh and a very cruel man, and had a lot of pro-Roman sentiments. So would have been very happy to rub shoulders and to scratch the Romans' back if they scratched his, so to speak. And we see Josephus, when you read through some of what he wrote about Ananias, actually depicted him as one of, if not the worst high priest that served. I don't know if that was just in the Hasmonean period or in all, but one of the worst high priests. But we see where he presided during the trial of Paul when he's in Jerusalem. So if you want to turn over to Acts 23, Acts chapter 23, and I'm going to read the first 5 verses of Acts 23. It says, Paul, looking intently at the council, said, Brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day. The high priest Ananias commanded those standing beside him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Do you sit to try me according to the law, and in violation of the law, order me to be struck? But the bystanders said, You revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I was not aware, brethren, that he was high priest, for it is written, You shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. Now, I would probably argue Ananias probably wasn't a very good high priest of God or for God, period. And I don't know exactly why Paul wouldn't have known Ananias, by either by name or by reputation, even though he had just gotten back from, traveling through Asia and in that area over into Corinth. But for whatever reason, didn't understand, or maybe didn't hear exactly who gave the order for him to be smacked on the mouth. But that right there, if you're ordering somebody to be hit in the face, smacked on the mouth, that right there kind of speaks volumes to who you are as a person. But then you also see the only other mention of Ananias in the Bible, at least the high priest, is in Acts chapter 24. And we'll get to this here in a little bit later, but you see Ananias travel to Caesarea with his lawyer Tertullus when they go before Felix to present their case. Before him. And I don't really have just a whole lot more about Ananias. Ananias, like I said, in the Bible has a pretty short reference to what he did. If you look historically, you will see that after he was, removed from being a high priest in 58 AD, he still stayed, there in Jerusalem, in that area, but was later killed by the Jews around 66 AD. And this would have been right around when the first Jewish-Roman war occurred, and the zealots, the hyper-vigilant Jews, burned Ananias' house. Ananias fled to Herod's palace, the Jews found Ananias hiding in an aqueduct, and they ended up killing him at that point. So, not just a whole lot of good things to say about Ananias. Any thoughts or questions on him?
I got a question about that part about him not knowing he was a priest, because didn't they also dress up different than everybody else? And isn't he saying, calling him a whitewashed wall? So is he being smart, or kind of when he says, oh, it's not, or I don't know that you are, is he just kind
Is
of,
he being sarcastic?
yeah, sarcastic,
Calling him,
maybe?
not recognizing him as a high priest,
Yeah.
even though maybe he did know who he was.
Yes.
I don't know back then. Somebody else may know more as far as would they have still worn a lot of the traditional, garb? Because the old high priest, wore the, this pendant with the 12 stones of Israel on there, the 12 tribes. I don't know if they would have still done that at this point in time or not. Darrell?
Well, the traditional garments were worn at specific times. They weren't worn by the high priest at all times. So I don't know, I don't think I've ever read anything about what the high priest wore when he attended the council.
Sure.
Whether he was dressed like everyone else or whether he wore something special.
You also have to consider that Paul had been away from the customs of the Jewish people for about 20 years or so at this point. So, I don't know, maybe some stuff had changed that he wasn't aware of.
Right. I do think there could have very well been some sarcasm in what Paul, how Paul addressed Ananias. And you almost get the sense of where, Paul is in a sense, maybe not knowingly, but indirectly foretelling of what's going to happen to Ananias when he says God is going to strike you down. It just takes until 66 AD for that justice to come about.
I thought the high priest garb you're talking about was worn only, I'm probably wrong, only when they were in service in the temple.
I don't know. I'm sure the Passover would have been one of those times, some of the other feasts or some of the other celebrations that would have taken place there. But like I just mentioned, as far as going to a council meeting, I'm sure they would have probably worn a little more dressed down garb.
Leviticus actually details what he should wear at different times during the Day of Atonement. He started out wearing what they called the golden garments, the ones that are being referenced here. And then he changed just to linen garments in order to make the sacrifice, and then he put on the golden garments again, the one with the breastplate and the stones and all that. So yeah, those were ceremonial garments. They weren't worn by him at all times.
But you would, as much as Paul was raised in it and knows, you would think he would still know who was coming here to this
Because he was a
thing.
Pharisee.
But I don't know that, I don't.
Well, and the other thing too is at this point, the high priest isn't based on whether you're a Levite, right? And so, as you're going to see as we talk about Herod, Agrippa, the Herods were typically the ones who selected the high priest based on who they thought would grease their palm the most. Hence the reason why Ananias was as corrupt as he was because I'm sure he was, for Herod Chalcis, giving him some of the proceeds and some of the gifts and money from the temple. And so there's you scratch my back if I scratch yours kind of mentality between that. So there's not that Levitical connection. Yes?
Well, I was thinking that it's also possible that Paul is implying something of the loss of significance of the earthly high priest, because he knows that
Right.
Jesus is the high priest.
Right.
So what is this man really anymore now that it's Christ's kingdom and
Very true.
reigns?
Very true. I think it goes back to, like, if you want to turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. So I think there's a lot of irony in what Paul is being accused of and being imprisoned for in all of this. And so part of it is, yes, the high priest is, because Paul knows who his high priest is. He's been preaching wherever he has gone on these trips who his high priest is. And that high priest is Christ. And he's given that in, I guess it was in Hebrews where we see a lot of that given. But when you think about even the temple, the significance of the temple for Paul had also changed dramatically since Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And so if you read in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 16, it says, "Do you not know that you are a temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If anyone destroys the temple of God, God will destroy that person. The temple of God is holy, and that is what you are." And so these are things that Paul had already been preaching on his missionary trips about what the temple was and who the temple actually was and who dwells in that temple, where God actually dwells now, and it's actually not in some building in Jerusalem. And I think still to be cognizant of the Jews, it wouldn't have been the smart thing, which he didn't, but it wouldn't have been the smart thing to bring a handful of Gentiles into the temple. You're just asking for trouble. But Paul understands where his temple is now. And I think that is probably one of the biggest ironies that I found in studying kind of all of these events. Any thoughts or questions on that?
I think according to verse 3, he did know who he is. He even accused him of, "You are a hypocrite."
Yeah. Right.
For sure he knows who he is.
Right. Well, that's
One more quick comment. Caiaphas, if you recall, had prophesied that one man would die in order to save a nation. And God honored that prophecy because at that time Caiaphas was serving as high priest. So even though Christ is high priest now, obviously, we still have a high priest in Jerusalem. And interestingly enough, God honors the position, and Paul honors the position, even though he has been supplanted by a greater high priest.
yes.
That's a hard perspective to keep.
About honoring one position when you know that there's one greater. I think there's a lot of that we deal with in our government today. So let's move on to Felix. So Felix is known as a former slave. There was believed to have been some relation with him to maybe some Greek hierarchy, Greek kings prior to the takeover of Rome, perhaps. Anyways, but you see him, eventually he is promoted as he's living in Rome to some higher up officials, and then ultimately is promoted by Claudius Caesar to the governor of Judea. A lot of people call it the procurator, but he was the fourth Roman procurator of Judea, of the Judean province, including Samaria, and he was there from 52 to 60 AD. And probably the biggest reason why he got that governorship was because of his older brother, who also served in Emperor Claudius's government as the secretary to the treasury, and petitioned for Claudius to appoint Felix to this governorship. We see Felix was married 3 times. His first wife was named Drusilla, whatever that location is called, Mauritania. And then I guess he liked the name Drusilla, just a different woman, and so his second wife's name was also Drusilla, but of Judea. That's the Drusilla that we're going to see in the text here in Acts. And she was actually the daughter of Herod Agrippa I and his wife Cypros. And she divorced her husband, who I think she'd only been married to for about a year, to marry Felix. And then his third wife, there's not any real clear evidence as to who or what her name was, but it is mentioned that he had 3 wives. And I would say Felix is about as rotten a scoundrel as Ananias, maybe even more so. Felix, when you read Tacitus, which is a Roman historian, and how he describes Felix, he says that Felix was a cruel man who was licentious and base, and said that he held the power of a tyrant, but he ruled with the disposition of a slave. And so there again, if he was a former slave and then moved up through power, you can imagine he was rough, very rough around the edges, crude, a cheat. And so there's not this great depiction of Felix. And so we don't really get that when we're just reading through the text in Acts. But that led to a lot of increasing crime there in Judea. One thing I was reading about that I'll share quickly is in 58 AD, Felix actually had Jonathan, who was the high priest after Ananias. So we have Ananias, we just spoke about him, and then Jonathan took over in 58. And Jonathan, I guess, held Felix a little more accountable. He would speak, I guess, to some of the higher ups over Felix, would criticize Felix and how he handled such and such situation. And Felix ultimately had Jonathan murdered in the temple by one of his own friends, and they were never caught or punished for it. But you have somebody who's willing to kill a high priest, who is now the governor of Judea. Which also kind of makes you wonder why he wouldn't have kind of jumped at the opportunity just to rid Paul off of his plate and not have to deal with him, looking at the way that he dealt with somebody like Jonathan, the high priest. Anyways, so when we get to kind of back to the text, and if you want to turn over to Acts chapter 24 now. So Acts chapter 24, this is where we're going to kind of pick up in our story with Paul and where Felix fits in. But Felix was the governor of Judea when Paul was arrested. And we mentioned it briefly earlier, but Paul, after he had met with the council, if you look in Acts chapter 23 and verse 12, you have this group of 40 men who they've made this oath, this vow, that they will neither eat nor drink until they have killed Paul. And so they actually go back to the council and they ask the council to bring Paul in so that they can have that opportunity to kill Paul. Which there again makes you wonder, well, how involved was Ananias, the high priest, in that plot to go along with it? But Paul's nephew actually overhears these men talking and making that oath and informs Paul, who Paul then informs the Roman commander of this plot. And the Roman commander, I think to his defense, is on Paul's side. Because you see the Roman commander, maybe not initially, but he's not consciously thinking, oh, this is Paul the apostle, I have to go and grab him from this rabid crowd there when he was at the temple. But you now see him protecting Paul from what would be the assassins of him, and then secretly transports Paul overnight to Caesarea for him to stand trial before Felix. So we see Paul saved from a plot against his life yet again. Not that he hasn't already tried to be killed a few times before now. But beginning in chapter 24, we see Felix is now presented with Tertullus, who is the lawyer that traveled with Ananias. Jerusalem to Caesarea would have been about 60 miles. And so it says, from the time that I guess they realized that Paul had been snuck away in the middle of the night, whether it took them 5 days to get up there or not, 5 days later they reached Caesarea to present their charges against Paul and to hear Paul's defense. And in verses 5 and 6, this is Tertullus speaking to Felix. He says, "For we have found this man," that is Paul, "a real pest." That sounds like enough to imprison somebody. "And a fellow who stirs up dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And he even tried to desecrate the temple, and then we arrested him. We wanted to judge him according to our own law. But Lysias, the commander, came along and with much violence took him out of our hands." And so Tertullus and Ananias is making their case before Felix. Paul's reasoning for why he is before them is, "I am here, or for the resurrection of the dead, I am on trial before you today." And that's in verse 21. And in verse 22, Scripture makes mention that Felix would have had some knowledge of Christianity, of what it's called here in the Scripture is the way. And so whatever knowledge that would have been, Felix would have been smart to have known what was going on in his own region, between Judaism and then Christianity, and then inevitably there would have, been Gentile Samaritans as well. But for him to know about Christianity, but he put them off on the side of the case and actually waited for Lysias, the commander who was with Paul, to come in. But Felix kept Paul in custody, but with some freedoms, kind of like house arrest, which Paul had been in before. But after Felix kind of dismisses the case and places Paul under house arrest, you see where Felix and his second wife, Drusilla, they go and visit Paul days later. And you read this at the end of Acts chapter 24. And you hear Paul, or you read of Paul speaking to Felix and to his wife of faith in Jesus Christ and discussing, it says in verse 25 of chapter 24, discussing righteousness and self-control and the judgment to come, which would have completely flown in the face of who Felix the man was. Somebody who previously had been known as a cruel, licentious, and base man who held the power of a tyrant with the disposition of a slave. But with Paul saying that, Felix became frightened. And once again, he sent Paul away. And you can imagine, after Felix hearing that, Paul was the one on trial here, right? But now, Felix, I think, found himself feeling like he was on trial. And not that Paul was convicting him, but God was. And so, Felix sends him away until a more convenient time. But, as you read through the end of the chapter, that Felix continued to go back and visit Paul. Paul stayed under house arrest for 2 years, I think primarily as a favor to the Jews. Also because I think Felix was hoping for a bribe so that he could find a way to let Paul out, or at least make money off of him. But Felix sent for Paul, and they often, it says in the Bible, and they talked. And we don't know what all of the reasons were and what all was said, but you can imagine that Paul would have kept on trying to pick away at Felix and break down the barrier to speak to him. But Felix was just hoping for a bribe, I think, at the end of the day. And that really kind of brings us to the close of Felix, because Felix lost his governorship. I forget exactly what year that was, but he was called back to Rome. He must not have changed very much, even with Paul and him talking on occasion, and was accused and convicted of cruelty and corruption. He wasn't killed at the time, but he lost his governorship and just lived out the rest of his life in Rome. But then we see Festus. And Festus is the man who succeeded Felix as the 5th procurator or governor of Judea. And he only served for a pretty short time, so he began around 59 or 60 AD after Felix was removed. And Festus only served until 62 AD because he died early on for, I don't know exactly why, but died early on in his tenure. But you see a vast difference in Festus compared to what Felix was. And so Festus was known as more of a fair and reasonable man. But as you can imagine, he inherited a load of complications and trouble from Felix's poor administration. And even if you read through some of the history, even during Festus's administration, because now we're getting closer to 66 AD, which was the beginning of that first Jewish-Roman war, which then AD 70 is not far behind. But you see these tensions mounting with Jewish hostility to Rome, which was greatly exacerbated by some of the widening health gaps or wealth gaps, anti-taxation protests, some of the clashes between Jews and pagans. Once again, ultimately leading to that first war. Well, we know Festus in the Bible as being the man responsible for sending Paul to Rome to stand trial before Nero. And even though even though God, if you look, I think it's Acts chapter 23 and verse 11, and this would have been after he had met with the council before he met with Felix. God tells Paul, he promises Paul, he says, take courage because you have testified for me, but I'm now sending you to Rome to testify. And so Paul knew that he was getting to Rome one way or the other. If he had been imprisoned, then he would have found his way there. But with the imprisonment and appealing to Caesar, that guarantees him probably more of a direct route. But when you see Festus in the scriptures in chapter 25, it really seems like dealing with Paul, it seems to be almost kind of like a top priority to him. You see Festus visits Jerusalem just 3 days after arriving in the province, so at the beginning of his tenure. And who knows what his knowledge of the Jewish law and customs and even Christianity would have been. I think his answer or his response to Paul in Acts chapter 26 is pretty telling as far as what he thought about Christianity when he tells Paul, you are mad from all of your learning, when he's talking about the resurrected Christ. And maybe he even thought that some of the accusations against Paul were suspicious, with what he had, told Felix. And what Tertullus had told to Felix is that this man is really just a pest. We think he defiled the temple, but speaks about this gospel, this Christ. But maybe all that didn't just add up for Festus. I don't know. And even after Festus had taken office, you still see where the chief priest and the leading men are still plotting to kill Paul by having him brought to Jerusalem. And so Festus actually appeals to Paul to go to Jerusalem from Caesarea to be on trial, which is what the high priests or the high council wanted to begin with. And Paul says, I'm not willing to go down there. He said, I'm willing to accept death if anything that he had done was wrong. And it's at that point that he appeals to Caesar. And Festus convenes with his council and then agrees in chapter 25 and verse 12 to send Paul to Caesar. And this benefits, I think, Festus in two ways. It, I think, kept him on the good side of the Jews because he's sending him for trial, and he's going to have to make his sixth and final appeal to the Jews there in Rome. But then it also moves the trial out of his region, so he gets to kind of wash his hands from it. Does that sound like another situation that's in the Bible, where somebody else washed their hands of somebody? I think Festus was to Paul what Pilate was to Jesus in a lot of ways by doing that. But Festus's conundrum is that before he could send Paul to Rome, Festus really didn't know what the charge was against Paul. And it would be typical for somebody to write a charge or a reason as to why I'm sending you this prisoner. It's kind of like when I get a patient in the office and they say, well, what are you here for? I don't know. My family doctor just sent me to you. Okay. So you have to spend a little more time figuring out, well, what's going on? And so Festus wanted to figure out more of what was going on. And fortunately for him, for Festus, Herod Agrippa II and his wife Bernice came to visit and pay their respects to Festus in Acts chapter 25. It would have been similar to the occasion, once again, drawing back to Pilate, that Herod Antipas would have had with Pilate there in Luke chapter 23. So Herod Agrippa, so we're going to kind of move into Herod Agrippa with this now and still kind of touch a little bit with Festus, but Herod Agrippa II, his official name was Herod Julius Agrippa, was the great-grandson of Herod the Great, which we've spoken about in other classes. But he would have been the last ruler of the Herodian dynasty, this Herod Agrippa II. He died childless, with no offspring to continue his rule. And of course, shortly after his rule ended was the destruction of Jerusalem. But his father passed away, Herod Agrippa I, when he was 17 years old. But he stayed in Rome, where he was treated kindly by Claudius and was educated, and until an appropriate time, about 3 or 4 years later, was then given some territory to reign. That was supposed to be a family tree. So that's what happens when you put black backgrounds on everything. Well, imagine you have Herod the Great, Aristobulus, Herod Agrippa the first, and then Herod Agrippa the second. The box is where Herod Agrippa the second is supposed to be. So anyways. So Claudius later gave him, so we had mentioned earlier, Herod Chalcis was actually the one who had selected Ananias as high priest, right? And so when Herod Chalcis had died or lost favor with Rome, whatever had happened with him, Claudius gave Herod Agrippa his kingdom, which would have been around where Syria was at the time, and also the responsibility of supervising the Jerusalem temple. Later gave it back to Chalcis, or later gave up where Chalcis, his previous territory, and Herod Agrippa was given the title at that point in time of king, and was given the territory previously ruled by Herod Philip II and some of Galilee. Later in his career, he unsuccessfully tried to prevent the Roman and Jewish war, which we mentioned already, ultimately siding with Rome, and was expelled by the Jews. And I mentioned Bernice earlier, and we'll talk about, she'll get mentioned 1 or 2 other times, hopefully, but Bernice was actually his sister. And so, even though, well, some consider that to be actually his wife, more of an incestuous relationship, but they never had children from that. Anyways, so Bernice is present with Herod Agrippa II. So I'm going to quickly go through the rest of this, because we've only got a couple minutes left. But Herod Agrippa obviously would have been very sensitive to some of the differences between the Pharisees and Sadducees, between Jews and Christians. He would have been a lot more familiar with the Jewish customs. He also controlled the temple treasury, the investments of the high priest, appointing the high priest. And so Festus would have jumped at the opportunity to have Herod Agrippa evaluate or hear Paul and to actually figure out what his crime was. And so Paul gives his defense before Agrippa in Acts chapter 26, and we don't have the time to read it. But Paul doesn't, with each of the defenses that he's given, you can see where he fine-tunes or he curtails his defense to his audience. And he does that with Agrippa here as well. And he's not engaging in this big biblical debate. He's not making any legal arguments, with this defense before Agrippa. But he's giving him his conversion testimony, starting from the beginning. And that would have registered with Agrippa. And so I'm just going to throw all these up here because I've got a bunch of them. But as you go and look how Paul is outlining, this is who I used to be as a Pharisee. This is how I became a Christian. This is how I was converted. This is how I was called to go and preach and to minister to the Gentiles. This is why the Jews are attacking me, is because of God's call for me to be a preacher of the Gentiles. And he also preached to the Jews. But at the end of all of this, from beginning with Ananias, Felix, to Festus, to Herod Agrippa II, the final judgment between these two men is Agrippa, Festus, and Bernice come to the conclusion that this man is not doing anything worthy of death or imprisonment. And Agrippa says to Festus, this man might have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. And so, once again, I think you see a picture of 4 different men who have heard the truth, they know the truth, but hearing the truth isn't enough. And these men, I think, ultimately were afraid that by accepting the truth, the gospel, that they would have lost what they would have considered their standing and their power. So, thank you.